My dear friends, good morning. Centaurs with human torsos, seahorses with fish tails, a pegasus with eagle wings, and of course, a unicorn with a twisted horn. We are quite familiar with these fantastic horses, hybrid beings that each possess an organ that belongs to another animal species. Today, we won't explore their mythology, because, yes, sorry, but unicorns don't exist. But we are going to ask ourselves a question. Couldn't we explain their presence in our history? In fact, why some societies have developed through time a real fascination for these horses, to the point of making them magical and wonderful beings, companions, or even enemies of the human being. I can already see some retorting that it is the dog who is the best friend of man, and I rather agree. But how many legends can you name that include a hero and his dog? Or a hero and his cat? Strangely enough, these animals that we come across today, every day, are not that common in the stories of the past. Whereas the horse, but there is an absolutely fabulous quantity of them. So where does this craze come from? In fact, for a society to truly characterize the horse in its legendary stories, the horse must already be a central instrument in its art of war. Once its strategic military utility has been proven, the horse then becomes a tool of political domination, and thus, a subject of epic narratives that gradually become legends. This is a very nice theory, but let me explain it to you with the help of one of the first recorded cases of magical mounts. Bucephalus, the steed of Alexander the Great. The king of Macedonia is indeed one of the first to use massively heavy cavalry as a shock weapon. Taking regularly its head, he flies thanks to it from victory to the point that it becomes the incarnation of the conquests which led him from Greece to India in only a few years. That's why he's often represented on horseback, as in the famous ancient mosaic that puts him in scene, found in Pompeii. Very quickly, the sources devoted to the history of Alexander insist on the extraordinary character of Bucephalus. In the novel of Alexander, composed probably in the 3rd century CE, we can read that the beast, too violent, is first locked up because it feeds on human flesh. But when Alexander, still a teenager, approaches, the text states that the horse stretches out its forelegs and offers its tongue, pointing to its true master. Alexander's ability to tame a magical and dangerous mount proves his quasi-divine nature, which ultimately destines him to rule the globe. And besides, still according to the novel of Alexander, his father Philip, seeing him for the first time riding Bucephalus, will say to him, "Hail Alexander, master of the world," a bit of a daddy's boy. The wonderful character of this horse is not only a literary invention. A few decades after the death of the conqueror, some of his successors put themselves in scene while riding horned animals, in particular on coins, like the one that King Seleucus I made in Ecbatane in current Iran around 295. The idea here is to represent the Seleucid rulers as the doubles of Alexander and his mount. In fact, in Greek, Bucephalus means ox head, an appellation that was quickly interpreted in a literal sense, to reinforce the image of an almost divine king, the only one capable of riding a hybrid and marvelous creature, endowed with real bull's horns. The figure of the monarch associated with a horse will have a lasting influence in the West. In Rome, there are many rulers, probably to resemble Alexander, who will display their friendship for their steed. The Emperor Hadrian, for example, offers a spa treatment to his hunting horse, Samis, an exceptional situation that proves the extraordinary character of the mount and its rider. The Western Middle Ages will insist a lot on the link between Bucephalus and Alexander. This is not surprising in a society where the dominant class justifies its power on its ability to fight the famous knights on horseback, to the point of making a parallel between equestrian prowess and political ability. In the Vulgate, an Arthurian text from the 13th century, the Lady of the Lake thus explains to young Lancelot, I quote, "The horse that the knight rides, and that takes him wherever he needs to go, means the people. The knight must sit on the people because, just as he who rides, the horse spurs him on and leads him where he wants. So the knight must lead the people where he wants by legitimate subjection, for he is above them." More than ever, the horse remains a symbol of chivalric and especially royal power. Bucephalus will take on an increasingly extraordinary appearance, while the story of Alexander knows a very large diffusion within the noble elite. In the 13th century, a reworked version of the Roman d'Alexandre features Festion. The friend of Alexander describes Bucephalus to him, and I quote, "You were born on the same day. It is a sure thing. When Philip received him from the Queen of Egypt, it was a young foal which had just been born. No man has ever seen such a beast. The spotted flanks, the tawny rump, the purple tail like a peacock's, the head of an ox, the eyes of a lion, the body of a horse. That's why they call him Bucephalus." Having been born on the same date as his rider, the king of horses is now one with him. As if, without his marvelous horse, the sovereign was only a common man. He has become a character in his own right. Bucephalus can be seen in many manuscripts devoted to Alexander's exploits, notably on illuminations from the 15th century that illustrate the episode of taming. Others instead show the famous mount accompanying its rider on distant expeditions. As if to further emphasize its extraordinary character, many artists like to depict it helping Alexander fight other unusual creatures. On a 14th century illumination, he even battles dragons and beings with animal heads. So much was then associated with the marvelous East that as early as the end of the 13th century, Marco Polo asserted in his travelogue that in Central Asia, in the province of Badakhshan, one could find horses descended from the seed of King Alexander's horse, named Bucephalus, all of which were born with a horn and a star on their foreheads. Numerous ancient sources evoke the death of the horse after a fight against the Indian ruler Poros in 326. Alexander would then have built in his honor a city called Bucephalia, or Alexandria Bucephal, perhaps located in present-day Pakistan. Medieval literature seized on this anecdote, insisting a lot on the death and burial of Bucephalus. Bucephalia is then placed on several maps of the medieval world. On the Hereford world map made in the 13th century, it is located in the wondrous regions of the globe, not far from the land of the giants and the earthly paradise, as if to remind us that the animal was truly an unusual creature. Medieval texts describe the burial in great detail. In a version of the Roman d'Alexandre, written in the 15th century, we are told, and I quote, "Alexander has a very rich monument made, which he has placed over the grave and tomb of Bucephalus. There are inscriptions on it by which we can know who is there and the value of this mount." In a culture where most people are buried in mass graves, this description, on the other hand, serves to affirm that an exceptional royal mount is worth more than a man of modest means, because it embodies, as would a crown or a scepter, monarchical power. Moreover, from the 13th century onward, sovereigns tended more and more to represent themselves on horseback, whether in illuminations or during great ceremonies, such as royal entries during which they rode through the gates of a city, open as a sign of submission, like Charles V in Paris. On the other hand, the Western Church prefers to put forward the donkey, this everyday animal associated with the humble and with Christ, notably on the occasion of his birth in the stable of Bethlehem or of his entry into Jerusalem. Represented as a common animal, Christ's donkey is a kind of anti-Bucephalus, whose importance is attested to in art. And we see it, for example, in this fresco by Giotto, done in the early 14th century, where he has his ears down as a sign of humility. The donkey is also very present in the liturgy. In Germany in the Middle Ages, during the Feast of Psalms celebrating Christ's entry into Jerusalem, a wooden sculpture of Jesus on a donkey is carried around, a copy of which is still preserved today in the Cluny Museum. What's necessary to understand is that the symbol of the marvelous horse is not only used in the Occident, but also in the Orient. The Roman d'Alexandre spread throughout Asia and sometimes far beyond. In Persia, for example, the model of the horse king is put forward long before Islamicization. And that we can see it well, since from the end of antiquity, the army also relies on units of heavy elite horsemen that will be called cataphractories. Khosrow II, a Persian ruler of the Sassanid dynasty who reigned in the 7th century, is thus represented on horseback carved in the rock of one of the caves of Takhkebostan in present-day Iran. Now, almost 600 years after his death, this ruler is portrayed by the poet Nizami in the long story Khosrow and Shirin, where he is associated with a marvelous horse called Shabdiz. Rostam, another Persian hero described in the very popular Book of Kings, composed around the year 1000 by Ferdowsi, is close to the horse Rakhsh, and their common destiny is very similar to that of Alexander and Bucephalus. Rostam is thus the only one who can tame Rakhsh, who is depicted as a terrifying mount. I quote, "His rump and chest were broad," the text says. "His eye was black, his tail raised, his testicles black and hard, his hooves like steel." The fact that the male genitals of the steed are pretty heavily emphasized is not really a detail. Marvelous horses are often famously difficult stallions and mounts that only male heroes can dominate. In a world where power and the act of war are associated and monopolized by men, women are indeed very rarely associated with magical horses. Exceptional beings who echo each other, Rostam and Rakhsh, have many adventures where they help each other to the point that the horse often participates in the fight. Rakhsh thus kills a lion while his rider is asleep, as shown in an illumination from the 16th century, where one can moreover notice genitals, a way once again of reminding us that he is a stallion. A hero in his own right, he also participates in a fight against a dragon before dying, victim with his rider of a trap filled with spikes. It's as if only the worst betrayal could kill this invincible duo, which is still very famous in Iran today. The horse has thus truly become a symbol of royal power, and so much better for the elites. But then, by association, it can also become a tool of the opposition to criticize this same royal power and support the rebellion. In the Chanson de Geste, Renaud de Montauban, composed in the 12th century, the four Aymon sons in revolt against Charlemagne managed to escape the emperor's vengeance thanks to Bayard, a fairy horse that carries all four of them at the same time, as shown in a printed version around 1485 of the legend, where the heroes leave Paris in a kind of royal entrance in reverse. This horse has characteristics that bring it closer to Bucephalus, notably its marvelous origin that magnifies its riders. In an early 13th century song that acts as a prequel to Renaud de Montauban, we learn, for example, that he was sired by a dragon and a snake, and that the enchanter Maugis, an ally of the Aymon sons, went to find him on a volcanic island where he is guarded by a devil. Here clearly Bayard does not belong to a king. On the contrary, he helps young nobles against an emperor. Given to Renaud at the time of his knighthood, he embodies the independence of a united knighthood, placed in equal rank on the same mount, in the face of a royal power which becomes, from the second half of the Middle Ages, more and more invasive. The symbol is so explicit that when the four Aymon sons finally agree to make peace with the emperor, the latter, resentful and bitter, demands that their mount be thrown into the Meuse with a mule hanging around its neck. But to the great anger of the sovereign, Bayard struggles, escapes, and sinks in the forest of Ardennes, where, says the text, he still lives. The horse, which had come from a space linked to magic, a distant island, thus ends his journey in a wild wood, another place associated with the marvelous. The political significance of such a text is not lost on anyone. In the Middle Ages, it was no coincidence that Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, who constantly opposed the French King Charles VII, commissioned a superbly decorated prose setting of Renaud de Montauban in the 15th century. One of the illuminations insists there on an episode where the enchanter Maugis and Bayard kidnap the Emperor Charles. Placed on the magic mount as a simple bag of turnips, the Carolingian is portrayed as a kind of discourteous anti-knight. Unlike the four Aymon sons, he is unworthy of being properly carried by the fairy steed. Philip of Burgundy thus takes advantage of this legend to send a clear message to King Charles. We simply do not have the same values. And I am messing with you. I am messing with you. As a result, Bayard also becomes important in the processions of the northern cities. We had seen in the episode devoted to the giants that these ceremonies were an opportunity for the great cities to assert their autonomy by leading gigantic effigies of legendary creatures through the city. A number of Flemish cities thus very easily appropriated the horse of Renaud de Montauban. In Leuven, if an image from the end of the 16th century is to be believed, a huge mannequin with his image was brought out during the Omgang procession. Here, the horse no longer symbolizes chivalry, but the urban group, united in a united effort, either on the horse where four townspeople equally play the role of the Aymon sons, or below it, where no doubt several dozen of them carry the effigy, while behind it follows a small, ridiculous Charlemagne, which clearly shows that royal power is once again being mocked. Even today, the myth of Bayard, which has long been celebrated by the literature of peddlers, rumors, then by the images of Épinal, clichés, is alive and well in the Ardennes, where the legend has marked the toponymy, the names of towns, but also monumental constructions such as the statue erected in 1933 at Boisséson. The horse of the four Aymon sons still appears in processions such as in Dendermonde, or during the Ducasse of Ath, where the current mannequin, rebuilt in 1948, weighs 600 kilos. The mount still embodies the will of independence against a tyrannical central power. In December 1941, the play Le Jeu des Quatre Fils Aymon, The Game of the Four Aymon Sons by Herman Clausson, used the medieval legend to evoke the resistance, as did the bas-relief created in 1949 by Louis Dupont for the Pont des Arches in Liège, which took as its theme the attempt by Charlemagne to drown Bayard. But beyond the Ardennes and Belgium, is there anything left of the marvelous horses in contemporary society? Of course, if we look at fantasy. For example, in The Lord of the Rings, the Maeras, like Bucephalus, only carry high-ranking men, like the kings of Rohan or Gandalf. Conversely, a hobbit of modest means, like Sam, is associated with a pony. But like the dragons, the wonderful horses of fantasy also come to embody a connection to nature that we would have lost in our modern society. It is because they live in a pre-industrial world that fantasy protagonists seem to be able to establish friendships with their mounts, as in The Horse and His Squire, a novel published in 1954 by C.S. Lewis, where the hero has as a companion a steed named Brie. But these relationships also reflect the evolution of our own sensibility. In an era when cavalry is no longer a weapon of war, riding a horse is rarely used to assert political authority, except, of course, in totalitarian countries like North Korea. On the contrary, today, equestrian practices have been strongly feminized. Riding a horse is seen as a way to establish a connection with the animal world, a characteristic found in The Lord of the Rings, where Gandalf, imitating the elves, rides Shadowfax bareback, taking care to take into account the desire of the beast, as he explains to the hobbit Pippin, and I quote, "You don't ride Shadowfax. He consents to carry you or not." So our rather brief journey in the company of these wonderful horses ends here. So we could have evoked many other horses of which speak the medieval legends, like Poifort and Veillantif, the steeds of Ogier and Roland. We could have spoken about Gringalet, the mount of Gauvin, of Sleipnir or Grauni, Odin's and Sigurd's palfreys. But notice in any case that each time they are associated with men of high social stature. We could also have dealt with winged horses and unicorns. But what I propose is to deal with these special cases in another program, later this year. In the meantime, listen, if you feel like riding a horse, go for it. It's fun. Thanks to William Blanc for taking us on a ride through time. Thanks to all of you for joining the adventure until the end. I'll be glad to see you soon for a new story on the Nota Bene channel. So don't hesitate to subscribe and leave us a little comment and share if you like. Bye-bye.